The question of what is the Will of D is one of the longest questions and mysteries that we've had in the series. Up there with what the One Piece is itself, it has been one of the longest lasting questions we've seen throughout the story. And following the events of chapter 1085, I felt like we were finally at a point where we had a decent enough amount of information and mentions of it in the story for us to take a full look at what the Will of D might be. And in order to do this, I'm going to kind of break this video down into 3 separate sections. First off, I want to examine each of the occurrences throughout the story where there's a sort of mention of the Will of D, and I'm not going to go into every single instance that a D occurs, but rather more focus on when there's more of a reveal or information we didn't have prior. Next, I wanted to look at some popular theories that exist in the community regarding the Will of D, about what it may stand for, and kind of just look at the evidence they present, the plausibility of those, and potential problems I might have with each of them. And then at the end, I wanted to look back on everything we had discussed prior in order to wrap up what my personal thoughts are on what the Will of D may be. So, to start off, the very first instance that we see in the story where the Will of D is mentioned significantly was in chapter 154. This was the first notable mention of the Will of D in the story. I had mentioned this situation in one of my previous videos, but it's where Kureha is talking directly to Dalton, and she corrects him about what the actual name of Gold Roger is. And she actually wrapped up this scene by also mentioning that Chopper had joined a dangerous man, and that the fact that the Will of D still lived kind of indicated that he was this dangerous man. The next instance we see is in chapter 180. This is actually in the Alabasta Desert, and Robin is asking Luffy directly what the Will of D are, as kind of sort of looking for a definition as to what their people are. And in this situation, Luffy shows absolutely no reaction or idea of what's going on, which really shouldn't be surprising, especially based on last chapter's comments. Imu kind of reminds everybody that while the D are popping up more and more frequently, they really don't know the true meaning of what happened and what it stood for during the Void Century. However, it also kind of does indicate that while Luffy doesn't have any knowledge of it, maybe those people at Ohara, when they were looking into the Ancient Kingdom, probably found some idea of the D or mention of the D. It makes sense if they're part of the Ancient Kingdom, if they led them, that there would be some kind of information about them. However, when we look to our next instance in which it's mentioned, you have to go all the way to Skypiea, right after they're pulled off the Belfry, and it's chapter 301, between Robin and Ganfall. They are discussing the kind of unlikelihood that both Luffy and Roger were D after Robin had seen Roger had marked up the side of the poneglyph. Just kind of, it was his Roger was here of sorts, but in a way, Robin and Ganfall were speculating and reflecting on how Luffy and Roger were so similar and how they left such a similar impression and how they're both this D, and how they may have been connected to the lost ancient history of the Ancient Kingdom. So in this particular instance, it kind of alludes more to what I think a lot of people see as the inherited will aspect of the Will of D. This is the same reason a lot of people speculated for a long time that Luffy was Roger's son, just because they were so similar. But I think a lot of those instances during pre-time skip, like with the bartender and Logtown and all that, was more used to kind of just paint up the similarities between Luffy and Roger, and this is another instance of that here. For the next instance I'm going to discuss, I'm actually going to break my own rule for just a brief bit. In chapter 506, it was Roger's last words to Rayleigh, and this is a point I'm going to want to revisit in the end, so I wanted to mention it here, but this chapter also does include where Rayleigh mentions Shanks coming to him for the first time after passing his will on to Luffy, and he mentions that he had said the exact words as Roger. That dream that Luffy now shared with his crew, but we still don't know what it is. Those words were so impactful and reminded them of their captain, which is, again, tying them back to this inherited will and those people kind of seemingly leaving the same impression on those around them. However, when you look at the next chapter following it, chapter 507, we get arguably one of our most revealing chapters about the Will of D in terms of information. This is where Robin and Usopp try to ask Rayleigh initially what the Will of D means and if he knows. He reveals that he does know, but then goes on to explain that even if he were to tell them at this instance that they would be completely incapable of doing anything about it, which is another interesting point I wanted to draw attention to, as I wanted to further elaborate on later. However, this was the same chapter where Luffy went on to explain that his desire to conquer is more to be the freest man on the sea. It is a concept that is undeniably important, and one that often brings a lot of people to tying the Will of D and the concept of freedom together, which is a cornerstone to a lot of the different arguments we're going to hear later on. But honestly, it isn't a consistent theme that we see in a lot of these other instances. A lot of what we're going to see continuing on is going to pertain to how D are kind of viewed as dangerous, and again on that inherited will instance, but keep in mind that this freedom mention here is going to be incredibly important for other points later on. However, if you wanted to look at it from more of that dangerous side like I presented earlier, we're going to jump to chapter 576. This is Whitebeard's last words at Marineford, and primarily it was his mention when he was talking directly to Teach, when Teach was just terrified and he's telling him he's not him. He's not going to be the one that Roger was waiting for or inheriting his will. But in this specific dialogue, he was talking about how the people like Roger and the people like Ace, people with that will, the Will of D, cannot be extinguished even just by killing them. And earlier before this, in the same chapter, it was Whitebeard's flashback to him drinking sake with Roger and discussing the discoveries that Roger had made at Laugh Tale. So this was him keeping in mind that he already knew what the Will of D was, and he knew it was something like this that can't be killed. It's incredibly important. This mention of how bloodlines are gone and their will continue to live on, and how they will be involved later on in engulfing the world in this ultimate war, is also touched on here. So the danger of those with the D initial is definitely hyped up here, and that continues into its next mention. In chapter 594, this is briefly after Marineford, more of the wrap-up worldview, looking at everything that's changing and shifting. You see a brief scene with the Elder Stars sitting in their room, and at the very end of this discussion, the Gandhi-looking character mentions how those with the D initial are just always at the center of these problems. They're always becoming more exposed, and they're causing problems, specifically Luffy, Blackbeard obviously leaving them with another empty Shichibukai position. And this is kind of reminiscent, again, of some of the recent comments we've heard. They're popping up more and more common, and continuing that theme of them being at the center of this storm, like Whitebeard just mentioned, with the Great Storm eventually coming. However, a lot of these comments did seem directly or directed more towards Blackbeard in this specific instance. They were talking about the dispersive power among pirates, with Whitebeard dying and Moria, as well as Blackbeard and Jinbei leaving the Shichibukai. However, I do think it's interesting that the Gandhi-like character shows a bit of an emotional response when talking about the D here, as it alludes to when the D bring this storm, it disrupts this great power, so they're obviously viewed as demons and devils and dangerous in the eyes of the world government and the Elder Stars. You can actually kind of see what their specific view of them may be and how they discuss them in the next mention of chapter 764, where it's Corazon telling Law really what he knows of the Will of D. And in this, Corazon speaks of the likeliness that The Will of D are going to bring that storm, so it's mentioned again, and potentially even destroy the world due to them being God's natural enemies. This continues on and on again, bringing up their potential to be a part of this world-changing event, and it is the first time, I believe, that it is directly called the D Clan, sort of making this group and associating them with this group where, as we can see, it's a bunch of different races and it's not a specific bloodline, but it's more just a collection of people, so that makes sense. But they also made sure to include a certain back and forth between him and Law, where Law asks him if he's a monster, and Corazon says maybe, which could easily be brushed off, but I thought it was an interesting way of looking at it, because in his eyes, what he was taught probably in Marie-Joie and what everyone else in the world is taught as a result of the world government is, yeah, they are monsters, and they view them maybe as these beasts that can transform. So in their eyes, they are monsters. I don't know if they truly are, but I just think it was an interesting inclusion that they kept it in there, that it still ties into that regard of the world view of these people. And the confusion is evident with Law. He's just trying to explain himself, how he's trying to pursue his own truth. Potentially, you could view this as him pursuing his own freedom from the destruction of his own world, but that could kind of tie in those other themes as well. And that leads us to our most latest chapter, 1085, where Emu directly tells Cobra that the D's were their enemies from the Void Century, and that those today are kind of ignorant to their true meaning of it. However, I think this is crucial in the fact that this dialogue really confirms the D-Clan was a group during the Void Century, and that they worked completely opposite, so they were with the Ancient Kingdom. There are a couple translations where Emu also mentions them popping up more and more frequently, as that kind of goes in line with what I had mentioned in a few of the instances before, and a lot of these were possibly even inspired by the generation that Roger's spurring on, so they're just seeing them more and more often. However, with the reveal that the Nefertari are also a D in this chapter, and even there's an inclusion of a brief flashback where Sabo is given a D as a joke in his name by Ace and Luffy when he asked them about the same thing. In a way, it's almost like this group that used to be very exclusive is becoming more and more expansive and inclusive to people that we didn't think were priorly part of it. After looking at each of these mentions and major reveals that we see about the Will of D in the manga, I drafted up 3 major points that seem to be consistent themes across each of them. The first of which is danger, or being dangerous. This is shown in the very first mention with Kureha mentioning he's a dangerous man. Obviously, the Gorosei and the post-war are discussing how they're always at the center of these danger, and then Corazon kind of describing this perception of danger to Law and the way that the world and the world government see them. The second point is freedom. I had mentioned it prior, it's a huge point to Luffy during denying the knowledge of the Void Century and proclaiming his version of conquering and his kind of dream of being the freest on the seas. But this is, in a way, kind of alluded to in a lot of other regards. Law is pursuing his own sort of freedom, so is Blackbeard if you really want to look at it from that angle. But all of them definitely have the third point, the inherited will. Emu mentions that it is passed through time, that it just doesn't extinguish, is mentioned by Whitebeard when he is about to die himself. Ganfall remembers that Roger and Luffy are so similar, almost as if they've passed one to the next. Roger's last words to Rayleigh, as well as Shanks speaking to Rayleigh, all kind of leave similar impressions as well and allude to that Will of D and inherited will. With these 3 major points in mind of danger, freedom, and inherited will, let's take a quick look at some of the theories that have gone around the community regarding what the D may be. To start, we're going to look at CBR's theory, which seems to center around the idea of the D once being slaves of the Celestial Dragons. Most of this argument seems to kind of strive to focus the D's undying will for freedom on them remembering their previous servitude to the Celestial Dragons. and their ability to free themselves is a reason that the world government is wary of them, according to this particular theory. But their recognition for their usage as slaves also was used to explain why they don't outright kill some characters that work for them, like Saul and Garp. In my opinion, honestly, I think that this theory sounds a lot better than what it is, because when you start to really look at it at a deeper level, there's not a whole lot of evidence provided here in order to back up their claims. It's more that it just sounds really good when you say it like that. And I think it loses a lot of its credence and credibility when you look at the end of it, where it mentions that the world government doesn't necessarily view them as enemies. Whereas Emu in the last chapter straight up describes them as the moniker of their enemies from the Void Century that kind of just has persisted into the modern day. However, I did want to point out that the recognition that the world government doesn't just kill these people outright is an interesting point. However, I think it's probable that they just are aware these people don't know their true meaning and purpose with this initial, and they also understand that they're incredibly capable and impactful individuals, so they might as well use them to their own benefit. So, in my personal opinion, this theory gets about a 3 out of a 10 rating. However, let's shift gears to something that I think is a lot more probable, and this one comes from the Alter Vista Film Gold discussion board, where we're going to call it D for Dreamers. And this theory hinges on the concept of those with the will of D being those with ambitious dreams and a dream's inability to be killed primarily. There's 2 main scenes that are used as evidence for this specific theory, and the first one is Dragon's appearance in Logtown right after he saves Luffy from Smoker, and during this scene, the narrator box reminds the audience of Roger's last words. These things that cannot be stopped. Inherited will, a man's dream, and the flow of time. And throughout this theory, they refer to each of these points and how they each kind of reflect a man's dreams, with inherited will being kind of straightforward, persisting through time, one dream to the next from generation to generation, and a man's dreams being their ambitious goals, which pit them against the world government and the world. The flow of time could also kind of relate to that inherited will. Obviously, time has to pass before you can pass from one generation to the next, but it could also relate to the Void Century as a sort of constant reference that has been brought up throughout the story, that there's going to be an eventual return. The day will come when the world government will fall. It's a passage of time that kind of just leads to their eventual downfall. And the other scene that's used in tandem with this is the scene of Blackbeard interacting with Nami, Zoro, and Luffy back in Jaya, where he gives his infamous And again, this could be a direct mention to the inherited will aspect of the Will of D, and it kind of reaffirms that all those with the Will of D kind of have similar dreaming styles. Blackbeard, to my knowledge, wasn't at Roger's execution, but he kind of is giving a summarized version of those exact words here, and that's kind of the parallel they were drawing as well. And out of the ones I'm going to examine here, I think that this is the most plausible, due to it kind of pertaining to a lot of the overarching concepts that we discussed of the D initial. And as mentioned in the theory itself, I do think a lot of fans would see this as a sort of simple answer to such a drawn-out question, and that people might be a little disappointed by this, but when looking at the different types of D in the story, I think it makes a lot of sense that the consistent theme with each of them has been that their dreams are what are creating these storms around them. And the idea of dreams and the chase of dreams continue to survive despite all this oppression because it's intangible and it can be passed from one to the next. So I'm going to give this one a rating of 9 out of 10. And that leads us into our final theory we're going to look at today, which is actually from Screen Rant, which is another popular idea that has gone around the community for a while, that the D is not actually a D, but rather that it is a symbol of sorts, and more specifically, a moon or half moon, which in this theory they seem to really dive into the differing parallels that seem to appear between the sun symbolism that you attach to the world nobles and the celestial dragons, and then some of the more lunar and moon signs that you see show up for their opponents. And some of the evidence that they use actually kind of examines more of the katakana and kanji that are used to write D in the story. Obviously, middle names are not as more of a common practice in Japanese naming styles as it is in some Western naming styles. However, the D also seems to be more frequently attached as a surname rather than as a D initial itself. And another point of interest that they wanted to examine was that radical 74, it is one of the 34 different kanji that you can use to write out the D of the Western language. And this is the same radical 74 that's often used for the D initial. It's the same one that actually shows up in two of the names for the two very important Wano families in Shimotsuki and Kozuki. They go further on to explain that this radical 74 can be referred to as the radical moon, or even directly translated as moon itself. And other instances of the D being mentioned in chapter 154, there's a moon and a full moon shown directly afterwards in the sky over Drum Kingdom. There was even mention of the caricature that Oda drew of Blackbeard as a child and how there's a crescent moon above him in that. And then another mention briefly of how the Lunarians were an enemy directly of the world government, and obviously Lunarians, Luna with their Latin prefix ties directly to moon. So after looking over a bunch of these random ideas, I think that this theory definitely presents some unique concepts. Exploring the idea of katakana and kanji is a great idea, especially with Oda's writing. He's shown multiple times that he's really about wordplay, and being a Japanese native speaker and reader has shown to give a lot of benefits to people like that in the community when it comes to speculating, because they can kind of understand and appreciate that writing at a deeper level. However, for this particular theory, it just felt like a lot of these points were so loosely connected, and if I took the time to think, you can undermine plenty of the examples that they gave. Like, off the top of my head, Luffy's the sun god Nika. That is a sun sign. That is immediately associated with the pirates, which are not the world government. Or Fisher Tiger, who literally freed the slaves of Mary Joie and then established the Sun Pirates, which were spawned in direct opposition and defiance of the world government. So when you just think about it a bit more, it's like, yeah, it's an interesting idea. I know plenty of people have brought it up before. The symbolism concept is an interesting approach. However, it just kind of feels like you're grasping at straws and that there's not a whole lot of evidence there. So I give this one a rating of 5 out of 10. So that is going to segue us into my own thoughts about the Will of D. This is the section that I know you guys have probably wanted to have at the start, but I made you wait at the very end because I kind of wanted to present all the evidence first. And to start off, when looking at the mystery of the Will of D, I want to establish that I think the reveal of the Will of D is actually not going to be as important as some of the other reveals we're going to learn during this final saga. Let me correct myself by saying that I don't think it's going to be insignificant in any way, but rather that whatever the D stands for is not going to be some dramatic or mind-blowing reveal in my mind. Instead, I think it's going to be something more of a statement or a concept that encompasses a lot of the different themes and ideas, maybe even some of the other theories that we've discussed before. And if you allow me to explain what I'm trying to say by comparing this mystery to another long-running question we have in the community, I think you'll understand a bit better. So, one of the other longest mysteries we've had in the story, and one that I think a lot of people forget about just because we haven't really had new evidence towards it for a while, is that the name of the ancient kingdom is a huge mystery in the story. And it was such an important piece of information that when Professor Clover was ready to reveal this, that was what spurred CP9 to execute him on the spot. The very thought of them hearing the name of this ancient kingdom. They were so threatened by it that they had to kill him on the spot. And when you can think back to what I had mentioned earlier in 507, when Rayleigh talks about them knowing what the Will of D is and knowing everything from that history, he straight up tells the Straw Hats that even if he told them, they couldn't do anything in their current position, meaning that possessing this knowledge of the Will of D alone isn't enough to change it without the power to enforce it. Whatever it is not going to be something that's so taboo you can't even say it out loud, likely. So when you approach the revelation from this perspective, I think that the D most likely stands for dreams, making it the Will of Dreams. This is very similar to the one that I discussed in my second theory earlier in this video, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. That has been the focus of the story from the very beginning of this long saga. A boy's dream to become the king of the pirates and the freest one on the seas. You can even take it to the concept of the devil fruits. According to Vegapunk, in his speculation, the devil fruits were meant to represent a sort of mankind's manifestation and dream for what human evolution could be. This also kind of supports the idea of the inherited will, as those wills are passed from one generation to the next and often become the dreams of these characters that are within the story pushing the narrative forward, with the D in the narrative kind of being these prime examples of huge dreamers. Law, Luffy, and now Vivi has a huge dream she's going to be inheriting. And when you look at it from the perspective of the world government, this is a group of people who have already claimed to be the enemies of the D, who within the world they've created, you have to pay this absurd tax to even have the notion of being a free nation under their protection. It's not outlandish that this group is going to see dreaming and freedom as a sort of disruption and danger to their power. However, in typical Oda fashion, I believe that these other ideas that we've been discussing as a community are kind of just like red herrings that are more specific examples of this over-encompassing notion of dreams that they all feed back into. And in order to explain my belief here, allow me to break down a popular belief among those in the community that D stands for Dawn. When looking at this specific idea, Dawn, in terms of evidence, you could say the first chapter was named Romance Dawn. It was there from the beginning as well as it being repeated multiple times that Luffy's going to bring about this eventual dawn, and people like Pedro are willing to even die for that. However, when considering this situation at a more simple perspective, think about Pedro's situation. He was a character who believed so firmly in a dream that they were willing to die and pass that will on to another individual in order to change the existing world. That at its core could be the act of a will of D, the will of a dreamer, to believe in something so much you pass it on to make a change. And just look at some of the most notable Ds you have in the example, like Luffy, Law, Zebek, Roger, Blackbeard. Luffy, he dreams of being the Pirate King, the freest man. And there's another hidden dream we don't know about, hasn't even told us yet. Law, he wants to know the truth of his fate. He wants the truth of knowledge and the freedom of knowledge. Zebek, he dreamed of being the king of the world. He inspired some of the other biggest dreamers in the stories, and then he was too dangerous for the world. Rogers had a dream similar to Luffy that we don't know yet. He wasn't to be the Pirate King, but it seemed like he was kind of set on turning the world upside down, which could be dangerous to the world. Blackbeard talks about becoming Pirate King, likely has a step beyond that, but his dreams keep growing and growing, which is viewed as dangerous. For each of these aforementioned characters, they're different people, they have different approaches, they have different goals slightly. At the end of the day, their biggest trait that defines each of them is they're huge dreamers. For Roger specifically, I think it's important to note that he is the only D in the story that even knew what its meaning was. So with this in mind, when you look back at those last words like I mentioned before, Roger's final words to Rayleigh, they take a whole new meaning when viewing at them from the lens of the Will of Dreams. Roger's not speaking literally, but he's saying that in regards to this inherited will, the dream that he is inspired with his life, his actions, and the words he's going to say before his execution, that would prolong his own dream into the next generation. In this sense, Roger and his will would not die. And if you're looking for a more specific definition, perhaps I can give you something like this. Perhaps to be a D, you have to have a dream that is in some regard tied to a freedom of sorts. Whether it be information, exploration, from persecution, or from rules, it's going to be inherently viewed as dangerous to the world at large. This danger is posed due to the dream's ability to survive, the end of bloodlines, countries, clans, and even time, as an inherited will be passed on. In this way, perhaps Lily even became a D in the moment she decided to pursue freedom and dreamed of a world that wouldn't be ruled by what she was actually creating. You could even take it a step further. Perhaps it is possible for any character to become a D if they embody this. Maybe that was the hint that Oda was trying to allude to us in the brief flashback with Sabo, when they just gave him the name so haphazardly. When exploring it from this angle, the answer may appear simple and perhaps even underwhelming, but it would be really logical and encompass a multitude of these other speculations that had floated around the fanbase for years. And I wanted to end it kind of by looking at a quote that Mihawk had during Marineford, where he had talked about Luffy's greatest ability gathering those around him, getting everyone around him to chase a single dream. That's creating a storm on its own, is it not? In that sense, perhaps the will of D is the power to inspire others to dream freely, to gather those around you to dream. A power to never give up, to never truly die as it passes from one spirit to the next and embodies the will of those who challenge the established norm of the One Piece world, just like how the Ancient Kingdom did 800 years ago. In terms of today's video though, that's all I have for you guys. I appreciate everybody for sitting through a much longer form video than normal. With this being such a hyped up topic, I wanted to make sure I was as thorough as possible and really explore it from as many angles as I could. So just thank you again for everybody who's watched and supported so far. It means the world to me, and make sure that you like, subscribe, and share with any of your friends that you think might enjoy my content so I can see everybody next time.